Picture this, a legal battle that's been dragging on for nearly 3 decades. I mean, that is literally older than most of the apps on your phone right now. It's a dispute packed with criminal allegations, denied paternity, and a massive inheritance, hanging right in the balance. Today, we're diving deep into the 2026 Supreme Court case, CP versus Respondent, to explain the source material behind it all. It is a high-stakes clash between a man's right to bodily autonomy and a son's right to his identity and his financial future.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the 27-year mystery, move into the legal showdown, unpack the court's 2-part test, reveal the verdict, and finally, explore the missing pieces. So, part 1, the 27-year mystery, a timeline of allegations. To really grasp the complex legal rulings here, we first have to unpack the decades of human drama. Let's see how this all builds up, because the sheer length of this dispute is honestly staggering. It kicks off way back in January 1999 with an alleged relationship. By September of that year, the respondent is born. Now, the alleged father, CP, vehemently denies paternity. In fact, he leans heavily on a criminal acquittal in a case that was filed by the respondent's mother. Following that, from 2003 all the way to 2010, multiple maintenance proceedings take place, but none of them conclusively establish paternity. Fast forward to today. The respondent is in his mid-20s, and we finally reach this 2026 Supreme Court ruling. We are talking about a literal lifetime of litigation.
And the stakes here are absolutely massive. After coming of age, the respondent didn't just want, a birth certificate with a name on it. He actually filed a civil suit demanding a staggering 1/3 share of CP's property. This transforms the entire case from a quest for personal closure into a high-stakes financial war. The monetary implications are huge, which totally explains why both sides have fought so fiercely for over a quarter of a century.
Which brings us to part 2, the legal showdown, taking it to the Supreme Court. After both the trial court and the high court ordered CP to take a DNA test, he didn't back down. He appealed directly to the Supreme Court. Now, to understand his defense, we need to unpack a crucial piece of legal jargon, res judicata. It translates from Latin to a matter judged. Basically, it's a fundamental legal doctrine preventing a matter from being raised again once it's already been judged on its merits by a competent court. Essentially, you can't just keep suing someone over the exact same issue if a court has already given a final ruling. And this doctrine, it was CP's primary shield against taking that DNA test. So CP goes to the Supreme Court with 3 very specific grounds for appeal. First, he argued that there can be absolutely no legal compulsion to force a citizen to give a bodily sample, that doing so is a strict violation of personal liberty. Second, he argued there was no eminent need for a DNA test in this specific scenario. And third, leaning heavily on that concept we just learned about, he claimed res judica. He argued that the maintenance proceedings from 2003 to 2010 had already failed to establish his paternity, meaning the matter was legally settled and just couldn't be reopened decades later. All right, part 3, the court's 2-part test, the precedent playbook. You see, the Supreme Court didn't just invent new rules out of thin air for this. They relied on a strict precedent playbook established by past landmark cases. The checklist is actually pretty simple. Step 1. Is paternity directly an issue, rather than just collaterally? And is there absolutely no alternative evidence capable of resolving it? If the answer is yes, they move to step 2. Does the balance of interests favor ordering the test? The court really has to carefully weigh the competing rights of everyone involved. What's really fascinating here is the tension. It's a classic constitutional balancing act. On one side of the scale, you've got CP's rights under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees privacy and personal dignity. For sure, forcing someone to submit a genetic sample is a massive intrusion into that privacy. But then, on the other side of the scale, you have the respondent's rights, his profound need for certainty, his fundamental right to know his identity, and his legal claim to inheritance. The court has to decide which of these heavy constitutional weights actually tips the scale. Moving on to part 4, the verdict, applying the test. First things first, the court completely knocked down CP's primary shield. They totally rejected his claim of res judicata. Their reasoning? Well, they said those earlier maintenance hearings from the 2000s were merely summary in nature. They were quick, collateral hearings focused on financial support, not a full-dress trial where paternity was rigorously judged on its merits. Because of that, those inconclusive findings from the past just weren't legally strong enough to block a full civil suit today. Plus, the court pointed out that there was absolutely no alternative evidence to resolve the question, since the mother's fidelity wasn't otherwise in dispute. When it actually came down to balancing the interests, the court firmly sided with the respondent. They explicitly cited, quote, the decades-long uncertainty and consequent risk of being permanently denied inheritance and identity rights. The court basically decided that the risk of the son living his entire life without closure and losing his property rights heavily outweighed CP's right to privacy. The verdict was crystal clear. The Supreme Court ordered CP to undergo the DNA test.
And finally, Part 5, the missing pieces, expert critique.
So, case closed, right? Well, actually, scratch that. There's a fascinating plot twist here. Despite the media cheering this as some massive landmark shift, the Supreme Court quietly marked this judgment as non-reportable. In the legal world, that's a huge signal, meaning they didn't view this as setting a new precedent at all. It was simply a mechanical application of existing law to these very specific facts. The media hype kind of overstated its true legal significance.
When you really dig into the expert analysis, there are 4 major critiques of how the court handled this whole thing. First up, the res judicata reasoning was incredibly thin. They disposed of it in just a single paragraph without deeply engaging with why summary findings shouldn't carry at least some preclusive weight. Second, the court completely ignored the realities of a 27-year delay. Third, they failed to use modern privacy frameworks. And fourth, they suffered from consequence blindness regarding the inheritance. Let's break those last 3 down because they are absolutely crucial for understanding the wider implications. Take that 27-year delay, for instance. Critics point out that the court treated the passage of nearly 3 decades purely as a factor that helped the respondent's case, emphasizing his need for closure after so long. But they completely ignored the reciprocal staleness of the claims. In previous cases, the court has shown real sensitivity to the toll of prolonged, repeatedly litigated disputes on an alleged father's dignity. But here, the fundamental unfairness of forcing a man to defend a 27-year-old claim long after courts had previously found no established link was just completely glossed over. Then there's the critique around modern privacy law, specifically the Puttaswamy proportionality test. Set up back in 2017, this is a super rigorous framework requiring a legitimate aim, suitability, necessity, and strict balancing before the state can restrict your Article 21 rights. Experts point out the court missed a huge opportunity here. Instead of applying this modern, robust constitutional standard, they just inherited their balancing test wholesale from a 1993 precedent. They basically failed to update their DNA test jurisprudence to match their own modern privacy doctrine.
And that brings us to the final critique, consequence blindness. It leaves us with this massive, frankly vital question. Should property rights be vulnerable to paternity claims decades later? The court focused heavily on status and identity, but barely touched the fact that this was a civil suit for a 1/3 share of a likely appreciated asset. Experts argue that property disputes dressed up as paternity suits raise some very distinct policy concerns about opportunistic claims. If a DNA test can be ordered 27 years after the fact to unlock an inheritance, what does that mean for the stability of property rights everywhere? It is a highly provocative question that the court left completely unanswered, leaving the door wide open for the next decades-long legal battle. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.